You will never stand on this altar, not with the blood that runs in your vein.
The microphone gave one last burst of feedback. Then the music stopped as Jasmine Carter stepped toward the center of the altar. She had rehearsed this solo for days, running the bridge over and over until her neighbors banged on the wall. More than 100,000 people were watching the church's 50th anniversary service online. Then Sister Patricia reached across the stage and yanked the handheld microphone off its stand before Jasmine could take it.
You will never stand on this altar, not with the blood that runs in your vein.
The congregation went quiet. No one in the control booth had thought to cut the live stream feed. It kept running, along with a phone camera near the back that had already been filming the service. Jasmine stood frozen, one sleeve of her choir robe twisted at the shoulder from the sudden movement, her hands trembling. In the third row, her mother, Deborah, had already pressed both hands over her mouth. She wasn't crying because Jasmine had missed a note. Nothing about the music had gone wrong at all. Let's go back several weeks to the audition that started all of this. Jasmine Carter was 26, and Redemption Chapel, on a quiet residential block in Atlanta, was the only church she had ever belonged to. Her mother had raised her there alone, working double shifts at a tailoring shop 2 streets over, taking in extra hemming jobs on weekends so there was always enough for shoes, for the electric bill, for the occasional splurge on sheet music Jasmine wanted. Deborah came to Sunday service and almost nowhere else. Back pew, in a few minutes after the doors opened, gone before the fellowship hour started. She never volunteered for the nursery rotation or the meal train or any of the small committees that gave a woman a name people used outside of service. A few of the older women had wondered about it over the years, in the low, careful way people wonder about things they decided not to ask directly. Nobody ever did ask.
Jasmine was the opposite of quiet. From 6 years old, standing on a wooden stool to reach the children's choir microphone, people in that church had known her voice was something different. By 16, she was leading the youth choir on the Sundays that mattered. She'd turned down a couple of chances to sing outside the church, a showcase downtown, a friend's cousin who did session work, without much hesitation. What she wanted was the Redemption Voices, the adult choir that led every major service in deep purple robes. She'd learned their harmonies from the youth section over a decade of Sundays, without ever trying to. When the church announced 2 open spots ahead of its 50th anniversary, Jasmine finally had her shot. She fasted the way her mother had taught her before something important. She ran scales after closing the tailoring shop until the neighbors thumped the wall, and kept going anyway, quieter, until she'd worked out every place her voice wanted to break. The audition room held 23 singers for 2 spots. Jasmine sat in the hallway beforehand next to a woman half mumbling scales into her own lap, and a young man who canceled his slot at the last minute and left an empty line on the sign-up sheet everyone kept glancing at. When Jasmine's name was finally called, and she opened her mouth to let the first note of "It Is Well" fill the room, the back rows stopped talking mid-sentence. Sister Patricia, at the judge's table with a legal pad in front of her, leaned forward. The associate pastor's wife set her pen down. When Jasmine finished, the room applauded, even a few of the other singers, who knew exactly how good she'd just been and clapped for her anyway. A few faces stayed still. One belonged to Deaconess Carol, a longtime board member and Sister Patricia's closest friend. As Jasmine walked off, hugging her friend Tasha near the exit, Carol leaned toward Patricia. "Isn't that Deborah Carter's daughter?" "Yes," Patricia said slowly. "I believe it is." "You remember what happened with her mother," Carol said. It wasn't a question. Patricia didn't answer. Later, she would tell herself she'd said nothing because there was nothing to say, that the matter was closed, that it had been closed for 27 years, that reopening it now would only hurt people who'd done nothing wrong. She believed that, mostly. It was easier to believe than the alternative. The results came Friday, posted in the church office. Jasmine's name wasn't on the list. 2 other singers were named instead, both solid, neither close to her equal, with a line underneath crediting the decision to each candidate's commitment to the choir's spiritual formation process, a standard nobody could remember being applied to anyone before, in any audition before or since. "You were clearly the best singer in that room,"
Tasha said, over coffee near campus a few days later. I heard 3 different people say it afterward. Maybe there's something I don't know, Jasmine said, and didn't push further, though the sentence sat wrong in her mouth even as she said it. She turned her cup in slow circles on the table, watching the foam settle, and didn't say the rest of what she was thinking. That Sister Patricia's face at the announcement had looked less like disappointment on Jasmine's behalf, and more like relief. At home, Deborah hugged her and said she was proud. Something crossed her face that looked almost like fear. Jasmine noticed it, filed it away without knowing what to do with it, and let it go. 10 days before the anniversary service, one of the 2 chosen singers came down with laryngitis. There was no time for another audition. Several choir members pushed for Jasmine. She already auditioned. Everyone remembers how good she was, one of them said in the emergency meeting, and a couple of others nodded along. Sister Patricia's pen stopped moving for a moment. Then she agreed. She had no real alternative with cameras already going up and the broadcast locked into the schedule, and said the word temporary 3 times before the meeting ended, as if repeating it enough might keep her from becoming a permanent fixture in the choir once the anniversary was over.
Jasmine rehearsed obsessively, running the solo late into the night with her bedroom door cracked so her mother could hear if she wanted to. Deborah watched her daughter get ready each evening, smiling whenever Jasmine looked up from her sheet music. Each time Jasmine turned back to the page, the smile disappeared, and Deborah sat a little longer at the kitchen table than she needed to, staring at nothing in particular. 3 nights before the service, Deborah sat her down at the kitchen table. There's something I need to tell you before Sunday. Before she could say more, Tasha was at the door, out of breath, holding up her phone. A post from the church's community forum had been circulating for an hour, screenshotted dozens of times. Does anyone else find it strange that Jasmine Carter is being allowed to sing solo this Sunday? I think the church owes this congregation the truth about her mother before we let her stand on that altar. Mom, Jasmine said. What truth? Deborah didn't answer. She was already crying. Deborah had kept the truth buried for 27 years. Now, with Sunday approaching, she had to decide whether protecting Jasmine from the past was worth leaving her defenseless against the church's version of it. That night, Deborah told her daughter most of it. 27 years ago, before Jasmine was born, she'd worked as a housekeeper for a deacon named Franklin. Powerful, respected, his word carrying weight in every board meeting. He'd pursued her for months, using control over her job and her housing to keep her from saying no. When she got pregnant, he told the board she'd tried to trap him. They believed him. Deborah was removed from membership and denounced in front of the congregation. Franklin kept his title, his family, and his reputation. The baby died 3 days after he was born, Deborah said. I had no one to help me by then. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands instead of her daughter. I kept waiting for someone at that board meeting to ask me what he'd actually done, she said. Nobody did. They asked whether I understood the shame I'd brought into the church. That was the question. Not what happened to me, whether I understood my shame. Jasmine sat with her hands flat on the table, trying to hold still, trying not to let the shaking in her chest reach her voice. Does Patricia know all of this? Does Carol? She asked, and heard how strange her own voice sounded, careful and formal, like she was asking about someone else's mother instead of her own. I think so. I've always thought so. Deborah's hands were shaking on the table too, worse than her daughter's. Jasmine, whatever you decide to do with this, I need you to hear me first. I have spent 27 years deciding, every single day, not to say any of it out loud. Not to pastor, not to the fellowship committee, not even really to you until an hour ago. I am not ready for the whole church to hear it. Not like this. Not this fast. So what am I supposed to do Sunday? Just stand there while she says that to me again and let everyone believe whatever they want about why? I don't know, Deborah said. I don't have an answer for you. I only know I'm not ready to be the story everyone tells at coffee hour on Monday. Jasmine didn't sleep that night. Some of what she felt wasn't even about the church. It was about her mother, who had let her grow up not knowing,
who had let her walk into that audition with no idea what she was walking into. You protected me from the truth so completely, she thought, staring at the ceiling, that I never learned how to protect myself from their version of it. She almost said it out loud at breakfast the next morning. She didn't. She wasn't sure yet whether it was true or just something to say to someone when you're angry and looking for a place to put it. In the hallway closet, in a small metal box her mother never opened in front of anyone, Jasmine found a folded, yellowed letter from the church board, dated the year everything happened. It didn't name Franklin outright, but it cited concerns raised by a senior deacon as grounds for Deborah's removal. It wasn't the whole story. It was the first piece of it that had a date and a letterhead. The first proof, outside her mother's voice at a kitchen table, that any of it had actually happened.
She decided, before she finally fell asleep near dawn, that if Sunday came to it, she would say enough to stop Patricia's words from being the last ones anyone remembered. That her mother had been wronged, not that she'd sinned. She would not say the rest. The pregnancy, the baby, Franklin's name, that part wasn't hers to give away, whatever happened on that altar. Sunday morning, the sanctuary filled past capacity. Extra chairs lined the aisles. Camera crews finished setting up along the back wall an hour before the first service even started. Backstage, in the small room where the choir gathered before processing, several members greeted Jasmine warmly, unaware of anything unusual. Deaconess Carol stood near the door, arms crossed, watching Jasmine with open disdain. Sister Patricia, clutching her clipboard, wouldn't meet her eyes. "There are things about your family that make this complicated," Patricia said, pulling her aside. "My family has nothing to do with my voice," Jasmine said, keeping her own voice level, even as her hands shook at her sides. "People remember what families do," Carol said. There was no more time to argue. The assistant poked her head through the door, calling 2 minutes to places. The choir processed onto the altar in their deep purple robes. The opening hymns went smoothly. Then the centerpiece song began, and as Jasmine reached for the handheld microphone on its stand, exactly as she'd rehearsed 100 times that week, Patricia got there first and yanked it away. "You will never stand on this altar," she said into the mic, "not with the blood that runs in your veins." For a few seconds, the room sat in stunned silence. Jasmine looked toward the third row and saw her mother's face crumple. The empty microphone stand remained in front of her. She gripped it for balance, then looked directly at Patricia, who was still holding the only live microphone in the room. The pastor, who had been sitting stunned in his chair, rose and raised a hand. "Give her the microphone." Patricia hesitated. "Now," he said, and his expression left no room for argument. Patricia handed it over. Jasmine took it with both hands. "My mother was wronged in this church 27 years ago," she said, her voice carrying through the sound system. "She was punished for something a man in power did to her, and this church let him keep his title while it destroyed her name. I was not born yet. Whatever you think is in my blood, Sister Patricia, it is not a sin. It's a debt this church has never paid." "Jasmine, that's enough," Patricia said, reaching toward her. But the pastor stepped between them, silencing her with a look. "Let her finish," he said. Murmurs were already spreading through the pews, and somewhere in the third row, Tasha had gotten to her feet without seeming to notice she'd done it. Then, to the congregation, "This service stops here. We are not going to decide the truth of a 27-year-old matter from this altar, in front of thousands of people who don't have the full picture any more than we do right now. The board will open a review. Until it concludes, no one retaliates against Deborah or Jasmine Carter. That includes everyone in this building, and it includes anyone watching from home who thinks they already know how this ends." Jasmine hadn't named Franklin. She didn't need to. An elderly founding member, well into her 80s, approached the pastor privately after the service and told him she remembered the board meeting 27 years earlier, remembered Deborah crying, begging to be heard, and remembered staying silent herself because Franklin was powerful and Deborah was not. She'd carried that silence, she told him, longer than she'd carried almost anything else in her life,
and she was done keeping it to herself. Backstage, Deborah found her daughter changing out of her robe, still shaking, mascara run halfway down her face. "You told them," she said quietly. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite forgiveness either.
"I didn't say the rest," Jasmine said, not turning around at first. "I didn't say his name or the baby I only said you were wronged. You still told them something that was mine to tell, Jasmine." Deborah sat down heavily on the folding chair by the door. "You defended me. I know that, and I'll never forget what it looked like, you standing up there. But you also put my name in front of 100,000 strangers before I was ready to be there. Those aren't the same thing, even if they happened in the same minute." "I'm sorry," Jasmine said, finally turning to face her. "I didn't know what else to do with what she said to me up there. I had about 4 seconds to decide. And I decided wrong, maybe. I don't know." Deborah didn't answer right away. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, the choir robe still half off one shoulder, tears drying on both their faces. "I know," she said finally. "I'm not saying you're wrong to be angry. I'm saying I need you to know it cost me something too." The review took 6 weeks, and it did not go cleanly. Deborah, when the committee first reached out, declined to give a formal statement. She wasn't ready to sit across from strangers and repeat what she'd barely finished saying to her own daughter. That left the 2-person committee, a board member with no history in the original case, plus an outside mediator, relying on the letter Jasmine had found, on old board minutes, and on witnesses. The minutes were a problem. An entire archive box covering the 2 years around Deborah's removal had gone missing sometime in the last decade. Misfiled, the church secretary guessed, during a basement renovation that had displaced half the old filing cabinets into storage units nobody had fully cataloged since. What remained were fragments: the disciplinary letter, a handful of adjacent meeting notes, and memory. One of the 3 surviving board members from that era, a man in his 70s, refused to speak with the committee at all when they first called him. That matter was settled a long time ago, he told the mediator, and hung up. It took a second visit, and a promise that nothing he said would be made public without his consent before he agreed to talk. And even then, he hedged, saying only that there were concerns raised, and that he couldn't recall the specifics anymore, in a tone the mediator's notes later described as evasive rather than genuinely forgetful. The elderly woman who'd come forward after the service was more direct. She corroborated the timeline, the wording Franklin had used at the original meeting, and the fact that Deborah had been denied any real chance to respond before the vote was taken. She told the committee she'd rehearsed what she wanted to say for weeks beforehand, and that saying it out loud, finally, felt like putting down something she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. When the committee finally reached Franklin, now in his 70s, he agreed to answer questions only through a lawyer. He hadn't attended a service in over a decade, but his name had never been removed from the membership roll, and he still carried an honorary deacon title he used at denominational functions across the state, which was exactly what the board's vote would take away. He did not deny the relationship. He disputed how it had begun, insisting, in a written statement the committee found unconvincing but couldn't fully disprove on paper alone, that it had not been coercive, that Deborah had, quote, welcomed his attention at the time. He called the renewed inquiry an attack on a man who has already answered for whatever happened, if anything happened at all, and suggested through his attorney that the church risked liability if it proceeded further without stronger evidence. The investigation stalled there for almost 2 weeks. 2 witnesses and a partial document, the mediator told the board, were not quite enough to reach a clean conclusion on the coercion itself, though they were more than enough to establish that the original board had denied Deborah any real hearing at the time, which was its own finding, regardless of what else could or couldn't be proven. It was Deborah who broke the stall. She hadn't planned to, but when Jasmine told her carefully one evening that the review might close without fully accounting for what had happened, that Franklin's lawyer's letter might end up being the last word on record, Deborah went quiet for a long moment, and then asked Jasmine to help her write down a phone number. She called the committee herself the next morning and asked for a meeting on her terms, a small room, only the 2 committee members present, No recording running, no audience of any kind. She told them everything, in her own words, in her own order, for the first time in 27 years. It was the first thing in this entire story she had chosen to do, rather than something that had happened to her or around her without her say. The committee's final report was careful to draw a line between what it could and couldn't establish. It stated plainly that it could not prove every detail of the original relationship to a modern evidentiary standard, 27 years and one missing archive box later. But it could prove, from the surviving letter, the corroborating witnesses, and Deborah's own account, that she had been denied a fair hearing at the time, and that Franklin had benefited directly from that failure. Based on the full record, the board voted to formally revoke Franklin's church membership and honorary title. His wife, who had known for years and chosen silence, left the congregation quietly not long after, taking their grown children with her. Franklin's attorney sent one further letter, calling the decision regrettable and reserving the right to appeal to the wider denominational body, though no appeal was ever filed. Deaconess Carol resigned from the board before the vote. In her final board meeting, she told the room, without much apology in her voice, "I did what the board required of me at the time. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have regrets I don't have. The board made its decision and I upheld it, and that was my job." A younger board member asked her directly whether she'd believed Deborah back then. Carol didn't answer for a long moment. "I remember her face at that first meeting," she said finally, more quietly, to no one in particular. "I've remembered it for 27 years, if I'm honest. That doesn't mean I did anything different." She resigned 2 days later and did not attend the meeting where her resignation was formally accepted.
Patricia's position was reviewed alongside Franklin's case. The board removed her as choir director, but allowed her to remain a member under a formal probationary process, with the review committee checking in on her conduct every few months for the following year. In a private meeting weeks later, she sat across from Deborah and Jasmine, and her apology did not come easily. She began with an excuse, stopped, and tried again. First, she said she had been protecting the choir. Then she blamed the pressure of the live stream. Both times, she caught herself before the excuse could harden into an explanation. "That's not really it, is it?" she finally said, more to herself than to either of them. "I heard what Carol told me about your mother when I was 22 years old, in my first year on staff, and I never once asked whether it was true. It was easier to believe the story I already had than to go find out. I don't fully understand yet why it was that easy. I'm still working that out, if I'm being honest with you both." "Why now, though?" Jasmine said. "Why not before you pulled the microphone away from me? You had time before the service to think about this." Patricia didn't have a clean answer for that either. "I told myself I was protecting the choir until the second I was standing up there doing it," she said. "And somewhere in the middle of saying it out loud in front of everyone, I heard how it sounded. I just couldn't take it back once I'd said it." Deborah reached across the table and took her hands. "I forgive you," she said. "Not because what you did was right, because I've carried enough anger for 27 years, and I won't carry it for 27 more." Jasmine wasn't ready to go that far. "I respect my mother's forgiveness," she told Patricia. "But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. I'll need time before I trust you again, if I ever do." Patricia nodded and didn't argue, though her eyes were wet, and for once she didn't try to explain that away either. A clip of Jasmine's altar speech had already spread beyond the church's own live stream, picked up first by a local Atlanta news affiliate, then shared widely from there. Comment sections filled with arguments over how the church had treated Deborah, and in a smaller but persistent thread, over whether Jasmine had the right to say what she said before her mother had agreed to it. Deborah avoided reading most of it. Jasmine read all of it, once, and then didn't again.
2 months after the review closed, Jasmine was formally welcomed into Redemption Voices, not as a fill-in, but as a full member chosen on the strength of her voice, the way it should have happened the first time. At her first rehearsal with the choir, the new assistant director ran them through the same anniversary song twice, and nobody mentioned why, though a couple of the older members exchanged a look that Jasmine pretended not to notice.
The church adopted a policy that autumn requiring documented evidence and a defined process for any decision touching a member's family history, rather than gossip passed down between choir directors and deaconesses. Jasmine sat in on 2 of the meetings where the policy was drafted, not because anyone asked her to, but because she showed up and nobody told her not to stay. Deborah joined the Women's Fellowship Committee that fall. The first time she spoke to the group, she stood at the front of a small room instead of sitting in the back, and her voice only shook for the first minute. She told her own story, in full, on her own terms this time, not because Jasmine had said it for her, but because she decided, on the same afternoon she called the review committee, that she was done being a story other people told about her. Afterward, 2 women she barely knew came up and told her, quietly, that something similar had happened to them, and that they'd never said it out loud to anyone either. Deborah didn't have anything wise to tell them. She just listened, the way she'd wished someone had listened to her 27 years earlier. She and Jasmine didn't fully settle the argument from that Sunday, not in any clean way. They talked about it more than once in the months that followed, sometimes calmly, over dinner, sometimes not, late at night when one of them brought it up at the wrong moment and the other one snapped back before either of them meant to. Deborah told her eventually that she understood why Jasmine had said what she said, even if she still wished it had happened differently, on a different day, in a room with fewer cameras in it. Jasmine apologized again. This time, without the anger underneath it, the apology landed differently. It wasn't the kind of thing either of them expected to finish talking about, and by the time the next anniversary came around, they'd more or less stopped trying to.
1 year after the altar incident, at the church's next major anniversary, Jasmine stood at the same microphone stand, this time as lead soloist. She said only a little before she sang. "A year ago, I stood here and was told I couldn't belong on this altar because of my mother's past. My mother is not defined by what was done to her. Neither am I." Deborah watched from the front pew this time, not the back. Some in the congregation rose to their feet right away. Others followed more slowly, a beat or 2 behind. A handful stayed seated, Deaconess Carol's old allies among them. And Jasmine noticed them, the way she noticed everything from up there now. For once, she found she didn't need every person in that room to approve of her before she opened her mouth to sing. Do you think Jasmine was right to speak for her mother before Deborah was ready, or should she have waited? Tell us where you stand in the comments.